good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever you are in the world. My name is Tim Collins and I'm the Secretary General of World Stainless, and it is a pleasure to welcome you all to our second webinar of today. We ran one this morning European time, and we are back on the subject today of life cycle thinking. This is chapter 2, entitled Emissions and Resilient Materials. Before I launch into the presentation, just a few sort of general and housekeeping comments. So everybody attending the webinar will receive the presentation, so you don't need to ask that as a specific question. If you do have questions, please pop them in the chat function, and Joe Class, who's assisting me with the webinar today, will make sure that all questions are pitched to me. There is time for Q&A at the end of the session today. However, if there's lots of questions and we don't get the time to answer them all questions that aren't dealt with today will be answered by email. So don't worry, everybody will get a response. So without further ado, I will commence. And the first slide up is just to remind people that this document is protected by copyright. So if anybody wishes to distribute it when they get it, then you do need to ask permission of World Stainless. And we do operate under antitrust guidelines, so there are certain things that we are not allowed to talk about. So if you ask a question at the end that contravenes one of those guidelines, I will certainly let people know. So bear in mind this webinar has been sort of sanitized from an antitrust perspective. Okay, so today's agenda. So the core of the presentation today is 5 things in the middle. I'll give a short introduction and then talk through what is life cycle thinking. Some of that was discussed back in December of last year, but there's some modernized stuff in there. We'll look at the impact of corrosion, what I've termed the operational service life, and then what influences operational longevity. Then, to wrap up, why would we adopt life cycle thinking, what's important there, and I'll summarize at the end before questions. So I hope that's all clear. So we'll start with the introduction. So as I said, back in December, I presented chapter 1 of this life cycle thinking set of webinars. And that webinar focused primarily on what is life cycle thinking, and we'll revisit a bit of that. Why should we adopt the concept? And we'll revisit a little bit of that as well. And the notion of sustainability modeling, and I'll provide an example of some of that. But what I primarily want to do is expand on some of these considerations. And to set the scene, I think it's fair to say that the notion of the disposable or throwaway society has dominated our world for many years. It's probably around 3 generations now. And associated with this sort of adopted or sort of prescribed approach is the drive for low cost things. And I think we've all seen some of the benefits of that, but equally we've seen some of the downsides too. And to sort of pitch a question initially, is the notion of things being widely available to us and low cost at the same time, is that really good for our society? And I remember as a young boy growing up in the 60s, my parents would often say to me, if you buy cheap, you pay twice. In other words, buying cheap things is not really good, because people then were used to buying things that lasted for a long time. And whilst the notion of the throwaway society is probably a very viable business strategy for many businesses, who does it impact on best? Is it the businesses or is it consumers? I mean, when you reflect on the consumer behavior, consumers need to buy replacement products regularly, or more recently, we upgrade purchases of service items particularly. And that's a sort of relatively new and strange concept. So it probably works for businesses, but is it good for consumers? And equally, has the notion of style replaced the notion of substance? Where are we focusing what we prize in the world? So thinking about that from a consumerism perspective, there's no doubt the massive impact of consumerism. And we've become acclimatized to the process where we don't even question it. We don't sort of stop and think. And this is despite our personal wallets are being continuously emptied by the impact of consumerism. And this constant replacement of new things actually uses up raw materials, which in turn increases pollution, etc., etc. So there's an interesting side story to this notion of consumerism. So should we ignore these sort of red flags and the siren song of runaway spending? I think we need to think planet first and still recognize we can be stylish at the same time. These are not incompatible things. So, what are the key themes? It's about buying durable goods. It's about reusing things, equally recycling things. Lots of materials today don't get recycled. Use more public transport, grow your own garden. These are all sort of logical things. They're not new. People did this many decades ago, but we've got more and more, I think, internal thinking as the notion of the throwaway society has progressed. So having set that scene and maybe been a little bit controversial, I'd like to start by revisiting what is life cycle thinking. So I'll try and sort of start with a little parallel. As humans, we know that we're born, we grow up, we live, and eventually, sadly, we all die. And physical things follow a very similar path. They are created, they're used, sometimes they're repaired depending on what you buy, and then they become waste at some point. So it's a very similar path to us as humans. And I think this is an important way to consider life cycle thinking. But then thinking about the waste, when we create waste, some waste can be reused and or recycles and follows what I call useful routes, because it's in this circular economy sort of way of operating. So that would be classified as useful. Some waste can be reused or recycled, but doesn't get that treatment. It follows what I call undesirable routes, and that includes things like landfill or dumping things to oceans. And then some materials degrade before the end of their expected lifetime. And this is another problem category in this. And when you've got materials that degrade before the end of their expected lifetime, that generally requires some level of intervention, which would be classed as a repair or some kind of maintenance, and that may occur more than once. It's a repetitive process. So let's just reflect on that from a slightly different context. So here's the comparison, humans versus things, whether they're products, installations, or whatever. So for humans, you've got 4 sectors: birth, grow up, live, die. Quite simple. For things, you extract some materials, probably from the earth, you process those materials, you make products, you install or build things from them, you use and operate those products or installations, you may repair, you may not, and then you dispose of them. So it's a very similar process. So I think it's fair to say that life cycle thinking is holistic, it's end to end, it's birth to death, cradle to grave, however we want to consider that. And it looks at the environmental impact of things beyond the simple manufacturing. So it's got all these elements there, from extraction of materials through to end of life. But let's sort of reflect on this in a different way. So if we start with the notion of raw materials being extracted, generally those raw materials have to be processed before useful materials are created that we can do something with. And those useful materials are then formed and fabricated. And from that, a product or an installation is created. Now, when you get into the usage phase of that product or installation, a number of things can happen. You may need to repair it at some point. After repair, you reach end of life ultimately. But for some things, you can bypass the repair phase. Some things are more resilient than others and will go through the usage phase to end of life without any intervention. And that's always an interesting consideration. At the end of life, something becomes waste, and then a number of things that can happen to waste. Some waste, as I've said earlier, is dumped to landfill and similar sad outcomes. Some is captured for reuse, which is great. Reuse is always good. And some is captured for recycles and closes this loop. So when we look at that whole sort of supply chain, if you want to call it with that terminology, you could say, hey, there are some things here that are good processes, and there are some things here that are less good processes, things that we perhaps want to avoid. So we can reimagine this chart in colour, so to speak, and I'd like to do that next. So if we start with raw materials being extracted, it's not always an environmentally friendly process, even though some of it is probably necessary. And similar thinking for raw materials being processed. If you've got to extract things and then process them to make them usable, it's probably not the most environmentally friendly process. But then you go on to create useful materials, and there's always arguments about the production emissions footprint of materials. It's always under question, but it's not the only bit of thinking in a life cycle that is important or can be criticised. After you've created useful materials, you form and fabricate things, not always the best process, depending on how that forming and fabrication takes place. But ultimately, you create a product or installation which is useful and would probably have a sort of good environmental footprint, and then it gets into the user phase, and that's great. And then you get into the repair phase, and this is the first sort of red flag in this process. If we have to repair things, what is it about the product or the installation that demands repair? And that's an interesting question. Is it that we've chosen the wrong materials? Have we chosen cheaper materials that aren't built to last? What is it about that? It's a process I would argue we should try and avoid, eliminate, or minimize in some way. And then you reach the product or installation end of life, which again is not where we want to be. We want things to last for a long time. You generate waste, not necessarily good, particularly if that waste goes to landfill. If you capture it for reuse, that's great. That's a really good use of a product or an installation. If you capture it for recycling, that's equally good because you close the loop and you avoid that extraction of raw materials. So you can see when you start to put things in colour, and this is my arbitrary choice, you get processes that are good and processes that are less good. So if we can understand in this total supply chain what elements are undesirable, the real question is, why do we want to keep these elements alive? And there are sometimes good reasons and sometimes not so good reasons why we would want to do that. Firstly, there may be no better alternative approach or no better technology. So it's what we're forced to do at the minute, and that can be very valid. There's also the sort of crazy notion of, we've always done things this way, and that might be good at the start of an activity, but is it consistently good? And we should question things. There's also the notion of, well, we're just successful at doing what we do. We've always done things this way. We do it this way. Why would we change? We're successful. Again, a bit of a strange reflection when you look at that. There's no imperative to do anything differently, and that has certainly existed for many years. You know, the notion of people thinking climate change was imagined as a feature stopped us changing and has arguably delayed change until quite recently. But I would argue that always is another way of thinking about things, and we probably have ignored it over a long time because people have been successful. And another way of considering this is that organizations, companies get stuck in modes of working and thinking that brought them success. And they stay doing those things, and that's referred to as active inertia. In other words, companies become actively inert. They're not evolving because they're stuck with what was working well for them from many years ago. And that's a reason why some companies go wrong, because they don't modernize and don't update and don't see what's happening around them. And great examples of that are the Detroit car makers, the Sheffield steel makers. You know, you can look at this notion of active inertia and sort of look at it for organizations that, for example, shared the same zip code. So to wrap up this notion of what is life cycle thinking, it's something that informs us in a good way about products and installations, and it allows us to determine if material choices are appropriate and cost effective, if the processes are the most appropriate, is the service life going to be expected to operate without interventions, do we create significant legacy costs during use and operation, and how easily can we deconstruct and reuse and recycle materials from those products installations. And that last point is probably more modern thinking that has only in recent years surfaced. But it's really important. If we create things that are difficult to reuse and recycle, that's a big red flag from a life cycle thinking perspective. So let's now move on and start to illustrate some impacts of life cycle thinking by looking at the impact of corrosion. And the picture here is probably something that many of us have seen in our lives, a structure that operates, but it's corroding. And one of the questions is, how much do we actually observe from this image? Do we notice the effects of corrosion, or are we so used to seeing things like this we don't give it a second thought? So in this section, I'd like to sort of reflect on steels because they are the most common engineering alloy, part of the metals group, and the global CO2 emissions associated with replacing corroded products will reach about 6.5% of the global total emissions by 2030, so within the next few years, and that covers all emitting sectors. And the consequence of that is the direct costs of corrosion equate to around 4% of a country's gross domestic product, so not insignificant. So why on earth would we select materials that corrode? Well, often it's down to initial materials costs, what people perceive as affordable. Short-term thinking dominates. You know, the creation of something and the costs associated with the creation of something are not necessarily associated to the same people or same group of people as the operational costs of using or running something. So short-term thinking does drop into this. We have traditions, as I've touched on earlier. People have a way of doing things. They like that, but it doesn't always mean we progress. There's a lack of awareness and an education gap about what's out there, what can be used. There's often client pressure that drives costs down without thinking more holistically. So that comes back often to short-term thinking by another party. And there's many, many more reasons, and some of those I'll touch on later. So given that we have some of these pressures, we don't always select the most appropriate materials. Now, to try and put things in context a little, this graph shows with the blue line, particularly, the development over 40 years of the emissions associated with the production of steel products around the world. And you can see it's a big number that has progressively increased over time. The blue dotted line is the sort of best fit polynomial graph to that, so it's predictable in terms of the shape of this. But you can see we're reaching approximately or around 4 billion tons of CO2 for steel production on an annual level up to a couple of years ago. And the dark red line is the emissions, the element of those total steel production emissions associated with corrosion replacement production. And that's a little more than 20% of the industry total. So you can see the magnitude of the impact of corrosion on emissions. It's very significant. So let's now try and have an interesting consideration of the impact of corrosion. And I've created a Boston box here where along the bottom we have initial material costs going from low on the left to high on the right, and then On the vertical side, we've got life cycle emissions. So we're looking at life cycle here, and that goes from emissions go from low to high. And there are 4 clear groups. In the top left, in the yellow, we have traditional thinking. And it shouldn't be a surprise that low-cost materials, as I've illustrated, corrode and therefore have higher life cycle emissions attached to them. Makes sense. You've also got below that resilient thinking. This is where the initial material cost can be low and the life cycle emissions can be low. So this is almost the prize you're striving for. This is utopia. To the right of that, you've got considered thinking, where you buy a more resilient material, it costs more, but you get a value from that in terms of lower emissions. And then in the top right-hand corner, you've got the crazy area, what I call money and material madness. So you're going to spend a crazy amount of money and you're not going to get an emissions benefit. The question is, why would you go there at all? So I'd like to illustrate this sort of Boston box arrangement by popping in a few, and it's just a selection of material choices. So carbon steels, we know they are affordable and useful products, but because they corrode, you get a higher life cycle emissions profile. That's not a surprise. And engineering steels come close to that as well. Probably will last a little longer, a little more expensive, but they're up there in that sort of left-hand corner. We could then take a look at stainless steels in my industry. And of course, we know it costs more, but you get the benefit of low emissions because these things don't corrode as long as you choose the right stainless steel for the environment. We could pop in here aluminium and its alloys, and that has a somewhat higher initial material cost and has a fairly high life cycle emissions. It's not the perfect solution, but these materials in this yellow box are what people think about in a very traditional way. We can also consider high nickel and chromium alloys. You pay a higher price, you get reasonable emissions, not quite as good as stainless on its own because the raw materials emissions are somewhat higher, which is why it sits where it sits. But then if we want to put something in the resilient thinking box, then we have to think a little differently. And this example here, the ellipse here, is a combination of engineering steels and stainless steels together. So you're talking about a composite materials use. And the reason behind that is because if you use a resilient material selectively at around 10% stainless by weight in this example, you massively reduce the impact of corrosion. Because if you know where corrosion occurs, you can use the stainless in those areas. You don't have to use 100% stainless. So I think it's fair to say that high life cycle emissions are primarily as a result of material corrosion and degradation. I will illustrate that later on with the life cycle emissions example. So thinking about the impact of corrosion and how we sort of consider things, I would argue that corrosion is some kind of hidden problem. And there are a number of questions. Do we understand where and why it occurs? And does that hamper our material choices? We probably, as I said at the start of this section, we see corrosion every day, but do we actually recognize and think about it? Have we just normalized corrosion because we see so much of it? Do we understand the consequences of corrosion? Because it's not very often we see things failing in front of our eyes. We will see things on the television, of course, when these things make the news, but it's not every day necessarily. So we've perhaps normalized it, we've perhaps accepted it is just there, and we perhaps don't understand the consequences of it. So to wrap up this section, corrosion occurs without a doubt, we know it occurs, but it can be minimized or even avoided by careful and intelligent selection of materials. And when corrosion does occur, emissions increase. The data tells us that, but why do those emissions increase? So the first example here is easy. If you have to replace something, you have more production emissions. So fairly obvious. Then there's also the notion of if you're working with materials that corrode, we apply protective coatings to those materials to try to prevent corrosion. But coatings all wear off, they break off, they flake off, they get damaged. So you reapply coatings. It's a never-ending task. And you only have to think about painting walls in your house. How many times in your lifetime do you paint walls? And most people will argue, hey, we have to do it because, you know, we're thinking about changing the look and feel of our homes. A lot of the time you're doing it because the other coatings are coming away and you're trying to sort of appropriately repair something. It's not quite the same as corrosion, but it is a form of degradation. And then when you're actually carrying out replacements, you've got operational emissions associated with that. And then there's the final element here, consequential emissions. How many times can you think of in the last month being sat in traffic because of some kind of maintenance works, whether it be road repairs, structural repairs, whatever? Those are the consequential emissions that come from disruptions. They impact not directly on the work that's being carried out, but other people affected by those disruptions. So it probably seems fairly obvious to select materials that avoid all these outcomes, but invariably we don't. So is it a question of obviously the obvious is not obvious? And I think that's particularly pertinent to corrosion. So moving on now to the next chapter, I'd like to look at the operational service life, but I'll start this with two illustrations. Back in 1955, Life magazine introduced what was known as throwaway living, the disposable society, however you want to consider it. And it was illustrated with a typical American family at the time with all these disposable products available to them. And this was seen as the new life. And we're sort of 3 generations on from that. But prior to this emerging, back in 1930, the Chrysler building was constructed. And it was clad in stainless steel. And it's still clad in the same stainless steel, which has been cleaned just 3 times in what is now almost 100 years. So the notion of sustainable thinking was alive and well almost 100 years ago, but was torpedoed, arguably, by the dawn of the disposable society, which has influenced our thinking. So when we come to consider the operational service life, we've got sort of 2 contrasting considerations. So how should we consider the operational service life? Well, I'd like to try and illustrate this with this following little diagram. So I'll start by putting a timeline in place, going from single-use items on the left up to 100 years on the right. And I'd now like to illustrate this with some different materials and products. So we all know about single-use products. They're primarily plastics, some paper. We use them when we get takeout meals, etc., things like that. We also know we have short-use plastic products, things that we'll use a few times, maybe even up to 3 months, and then just dispose of them because they break, they become discolored, etc. But there's also other plastic products that will last much longer. And we can think of a brand I won't name that makes plastic food containers, has them for many, many decades, that are very reliable, and they last many years in some cases. We then have in this illustration carbon and alloy steel products that can last a significant amount of time, maybe up to 75 years quite effectively. We equally have composite material products where there's 2 or more materials together in a product or an installation, and they tend to last a fairly long time too. And then, of course, you would expect me not to exclude stainless steel products, which are designed to have long service lives. So you've got this chart now with a selection of materials and operational service lives on it. However, we now need to sort of segment that into sort of 3 areas. The first area in the top sort of left-hand side is what I would term disposable products. These are not things that are built to last. Then you've got in the middle section what I term repairable or maintainable products. They are designed to last longer, not necessarily last forever, but they require some form of intervention. And then at the bottom, you have sustainable products, things that are designed to last many generations. And for stainless steels, we're not saying more than 100 years yet, because the industry will only be 110 years old this year. So we don't have the longevity to say, hey, it's definitely more than 100 years, but we believe it is. But when you think about products in this sort of categorization, it's quite easy then to say things that are in the disposable category will have high life costs because you continually buy and dispose, And there are costs that come with that, whether they be personal costs or environmental costs or movement of products, because there's lots of transport costs when you dispose of things regularly. So high life costs, and things that are sustainable have low life costs because they're designed to last and they're designed not to have interventions. So this is one area where I think we have to consider the operational service life we really want. And there's no doubt that designing something for both reusability and recyclability improves as you move down this hierarchy. So let's now try and put this in context by considering the notion of a car. What happens when we buy a car? We know there are things that happen, and we think about these things up front before we make the purchase. For many people, it's a big purchase. So you have to purchase the car, insure it, pay tax, you drive it on various sort of days out, whether it's for work or holidays, etc. You have to put fuel or energy into the car. You have to get the car repaired because things wear out, things break down, and eventually you decide, hey, I want to upgrade. The notion of consumerism is stepping in again, and you sell or trade in the car. The important thing here is all of those things tend to be thought about. So before we make the purchase, we think about the relative impact of these things, maybe not in a detailed way, but we do tend to think about it. And that is a simple attempt at life cycle thinking, because this is a big personal purchase for many people. So if we now illustrate that with a couple of charts, I'll start with a new car. You buy a new car, it costs value over a number of years of use. You put fuel into it, you repair it, you sell it, you get some money back, but you incur a cost overall, the sort of brown box on the right. If you choose to buy an older car, you pay initially less. You still have to put fuel in, probably a little more, because it won't be as efficient. There's probably more repairs. You don't get as much money as you sell. And again, you've incurred a cost that maybe over the usage life is a little less compared to a new car. And you make those judgments, and they're perfectly reasonable and sensible judgments. However, let's now think about that from another perspective. So we accept that cars cost us money during their operational life, the life we have them for. And we can have some influence of that cost. Reliable brands, generally lower repair costs, the electric vehicles, lower fuel costs. So we make sort of choices here. But when we move to much larger things, do we adopt the same logic? When we're in our professional world, do we think in exactly the same way, or do we adopt short-term thinking? And why does that happen if we're more aligned to short-term thinking in our professional world, I should say? Are we in some way subliminally encouraged to think in a suboptimal way? Have we become silo thinkers because of organizational pressure or cultures? Do we ever question it, or do we just choose to conform because that's the company culture? And I'd like to sort of illustrate this using an example of a UK road bridge. And this is actual data. It was a small road bridge when it was built. And in year one, it cost a little less than 30 million euros to buy. I've put it in euros, so this is a currency that people probably are reasonably okay with. It's close to €1, $1. So you can, if you're in the Americas, you can make a similar assessment. And for the first 3 years, there were no extra costs during the operation of this bridge. And the bridge was a concrete reinforced carbon steel structure. It was in an area where there was a corrosive atmosphere, which hadn't been properly taken into account. And by year 4, some form of repairs were needed, and that came at a cost. And thereafter, every 2 years, more repairs were needed. So you can see the increase in the cost over, in this case, 15 years. I've only considered 15 years. But after 15 years, the total cost was more than double the original build cost. So that's a huge impact. Now, had that structure been thought about more carefully for its operational environment, which I already said was corrosive, and some element of stainless steel had been chosen for the reinforcement, around 10%, the resulting cost would have followed this green line. So you start a little bit higher in terms of build cost. And of course, you've got other costs along the way, including inspections and checks, but the increase in cost is much shallower. And really, that notion of putting in about 10% stainless steel reinforcement would have been a game changer in terms of costs. It's a massive shift. The actual example went from 28 million euros to 61 million euros of cost in 15 years, compared to 31 to 37 if 10% stainless steel had been chosen. It's a huge difference. We're not talking sort of marginal numbers here. And this is just one example, and there are many examples like this where what I call intellectual materials thinking becomes a game changer. Not only do you get the sort of resilience of the structure, you get to spend less money along the way as well. So let's wrap up this section by saying, hey, if resilient materials actually improve the operational service life, why would we not make those material choices? And there's probably several reasons. Organisation pressures. Is groupthink still alive and well? This is a real issue that we get to follow the views of few individuals that are maybe not properly thought out, and we all get to conform. And that's not always confirmation that is people are doing with natural thought. It's following the group line. Do short-term incentives massively influence our thoughts? If you're working in procurement and you're incented by buying low-cost materials, do you make the right material choices because your incentive is a local one and it's not aligned to the operational incentives? That happens. Are we sort of forced into silo thinking because our span of influence is very limited? That follows on from, the incentive thing. If we have a limited sphere of influence, we don't make the best decisions. Are we bounded by traditions? As I said earlier in this is the way we do business. It works. And does our organizational culture or organizational type dominate how we behave? Are we locked into some kind of psychic prison? Is our organization like a religion, a church? Is it more like a machine where you just do certain things and only those things? And do we have dominant people within our organizations that impose things on us? These are all reasons why things can be inappropriately chosen because of all these different organizational types. So moving on now, we've sort of touched on a number of factors, but what influences operational longevity? And there's two sort of images here, one to show a person that's under pressure, under stress, and one to show a group of people that have time to think. And the time to think is really important. So we'll start by just reflecting on what negatively influences operational longevity. And I'm not going to read all these things out, but there's some really interesting features in here. One is about sort of lack of knowledge, ignorance or absence of or poor training. And they really impact on people in quite an inappropriate way. You also get pressure, whether that comes from managers within the organization or from clients, and that negatively influences operational outcomes. If the client says, hey, you've got to take your costs down by 10%, suboptimal decisions are made. We also have policies or visions and missions that are short-termist in their nature. And that sort of knocks on then to mean that we make weak material choices. If we're constantly under pressure, as shown in one of the images, we don't get time to think effectively, so we don't make the best decisions. And then if you flip that over and say, hey, what positively influences operational longevity? It's almost all the opposites. That clear vision, highly trained people, highly informed people, information sharing, these are all good. The notion of thinking over the life cycle rather than thinking over the material and the local business costs. Giving people time makes a huge difference. We should all have thinking time in our day, and if we don't, we will sub-optimize our thoughts. We should never forget these things, because if we do, it will be difficult to adopt life cycle thinking. But why? Why would we choose this approach? If you're forced into the short-term, low-cost aligned thinking, if you're not given thinking time, you get unintended consequences. And some of those are products that don't last very long. Their operational service lives are short, and that can create unnecessary consumption. And the question is, who really benefits from unnecessary consumption? It might be good for certain businesses, but it's certainly not good for the planet. Products that have poor recycling rates is an unintended consequence, and that increases the amount of landfill and waste dumping, and much of it is hidden from us because we don't want it in our backyard. There's a lot of NIMBYism that goes around. We'd rather see these things disappear from our shores, and that's not good either. There's also the notion of high cost to use or operate manufactured items or products. We don't think far enough down the supply chain, and we don't think about avoidable material degradation. So material longevity just needs a little thought. It doesn't need lots of money. And then when we do all these things and we get all these things wrong, we result in high emissions, which contributes to global warming and other extreme events that are not required. So, in essence, short-term, low-cost thinking wrecks lives and it wrecks our planet. And is that intellectual? I would argue not. So, another perspective, another Boston box. Now, here I'd like to look at the term of our thinking on the vertical axis from short to long against, again, initial material cost. Now, in the bottom left here, we have single-use, single material products, and these have very low after-use value. They're generally landfilled or dumped to end of life, and they are truly unsustainable. This is not the way to go, but we have a lot of these things in our society. Every year at the minute, we consume more than 7 billion single-use plastic food containers through takeaways. This is that type of material in this bottom box. Alongside that, we have what I call style over substance products. These are fashion fads that are ultimately discarded and so are therefore unsustainable too. And we pay a lot of money for these things because we're influenced in the short term. We're hooked onto things by the way they are marketed. Then in the top right, we have the differentiated selling, what I call the luxury products. And these can be single or multi-material products. They are things that probably appreciate in value over time. And they're probably sustainable because the types of products, they could be reused and recycled and often are reused through a reselling route. So these are probably quite good products, but are not huge in terms of volume. And then we have the smarter things. Smart use of one or several materials. They can be single material, they can be composite products, and they're perfectly sustainable if we can separate the materials at end of life. If that is enabled, these are the products that will work well in our society because they'll have a long life, they'll be designed with long life, and they will have a reasonable initial material cost. Not maybe the lowest of cost, but definitely they will avoid future costs. So we should think in this sort of top left-hand box always. Now here's an example. This is based on life cycle emissions, but would be pretty similar for life cycle costs. This is based on street furniture, looking over a time horizon of 30 years. 4 different materials here, the middle 2 of which are stainless. We've got galvanized carbon steel on the left, traditional 304 18/8 stainless in the middle left, 2304 duplex middle right, and then high density polyethylene. And the staggering thing here is looking at these products or these materials for street furniture over a 30-year term, you see a huge difference in life cycle emissions. And that's because the 2 outer material types require regular interventions. They degrade, they corrode, they fail, so require repairs and replacements. And that's where the emissions pops up. So if you choose resilient materials, you'll naturally reduce emissions and naturally reduce cost too. And this is a great example. This is based on the city of Melbourne in Australia, who have been working with stainless steel street furniture for more than 30 years themselves. So they've got the data to support this. So it's a really interesting little case study, and I've just taken an extract from that to illustrate. So in summary, on resilient materials, they require less in-service interventions and deliver much reduced life cycle emissions. It's very simple. So why adopt life cycle thinking as we get to the end of this? It delivers positive long-term societal benefits in terms of emissions, costs and waste. It's better for a safer societal choice because you get long-lasting things, so everything's easier to deal with. It supports global megatrends like ongoing mass urbanisation and our future mobility needs. You don't have to intervene, therefore you don't cause the chaos that interventions bring. And it assists economic development and makes things more equitable for everybody. So in summary, to wrap up this, when we think about emissions, we should remember that somewhere between 70 and 75% of emissions are associated with a product or installation in its usage or operational phase, not in the creation. And suboptimal material choices heavily contribute to that poor outcome. Corrosion and degradation bring emissions. But have we been rewired? Because we've had 3 generations now of the throwaway society. It's rewired our thinking, and our love of convenience has moved acceptable norms. Therefore, undesirable outcomes become hidden from view. They're exported. They're somebody else's problem, but we've created them. So, life cycle thinking, I would argue, is a key tool. It will help improve our societal impact. It's about optimal materials understanding and therefore selection. It's end-to-end cost controls to reduce emissions. It's about having our organisations developed and mature and being long-term focused, and that in turn delivers shared benefits. We get from that items that are built to last. We don't have the interventions, and that impacts positively on our health. We can all make a difference in this, but sitting back and being passive is not what we should do. We must think sustainable materials, not single-use materials. And therefore, bringing this to an end, sustainable thinking does not mean expensive material choices, but it does mean making intellectual material choices. And to illustrate that, infrastructure made from carbon steel and concrete can be reimagined. You can use stainless in the locations that would corrode first, and that's the game changer. That small additional upfront cost prevents a world of future cost pain, as I would describe it, and then all the things, all the baggage that comes with that in terms of emissions and disruption. So that's the end of the webinar. I'd like to thank everybody for their attention. And now I'd like to sort of ask Joe if we have any questions.
Thank you, Tim. Let me see. There's one coming in here. Do you believe that people even care about the notion of resilient materials? Whether they, know why they are good for our society or for the planet?
I think that's a fantastic question, because I think it's not that people don't necessarily care. I think they don't know or know enough. I think that's a problem in how information is provided in our society. We've been sort of overwhelmed with what I would call the McDonaldization of society. And I know that's linked to a certain takeaway brand, but it's also a book that I read some years ago. And it's how, as a sort of group of people, we can become conditioned to things that are not appropriate. And once you reinforce that conditioning, you get a change of behavior. That's not always good, but it's not necessarily intended to be poor either. So I think that we need people at governmental level, lobbying group level, and people who are responsible for making sound material choices across the world to promote the right things, to deliver the right messages. And it's not that we should abandon certain things, but we should realign certain things. So I do think the question sort of accurately reflects a societal problem, but I think it's because we've been conditioned, and it's time to be reconditioned, if I can use that expression.
Thank you. Next question. Have you ever compared the impact of the reuse of steel products, so extended life, versus plastic in LCA perspective?
Yes, I have. Yes. And this is really interesting. Let's take the example of a takeaway container. So if and I'm going to just use some comparative numbers now, but if a takeaway food container cost $1 or €1, an equivalent stainless steel container would cost €28 or $28. They don't actually cost these numbers, but just to put it in perspective, the stainless container is about 28 times more expensive. So you'd think, hey, why the hell would I use that? But once you start adding on the environmental cost that everybody ends up paying indirectly, it only takes 15 uses of a stainless steel container for the stainless steel container to be more cost effective than the plastic container. And the fact is, we don't all see these hidden costs that we're all paying through different taxes and charges. And if we choose the right materials and we can reuse them over and over again, these products, and the takeaway container is a great example because there's just a crazy number of them about, then ultimately society benefits. And there are now companies starting to introduce, and they're working certainly in South Korea, I know, in Canada, I know, and other countries are developing reusable stainless steel containers for takeaway foods. And a third-party company collects and cleans and returns these things on the customer's behalf. So it's a very simple system. So we just have to reimagine things in a slightly different way and be more acutely aware. There's an educational dimension here to get the notion of the costs, the hidden costs that people are paying and they don't know about it as well. So yes, we have looked at this, and it's quite interesting. If you look at emissions, the sort of comparison is dramatic, and dramatically in favour of the sustainable materials. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, and otherwise we can send on more data to the person who asked.
We can, yeah, we can share the data.
Yes. I have another question. How can we convince senior professional people to think about resilient materials when they have a clearly formed view of the materials they think are most suitable?
Yeah, that's a very compelling question, because that is one of the real challenges, that you have people who don't understand enough. And to bring into play a group of people that would be applicable to would be investment companies who are aligned to environmental and social beneficial investments. They look at industries like the metals industries generally, whether it be steel, aluminium, copper, and see them as dirty, polluting industries, because all they look at is their vision of smokestacks, production plants, and they don't understand the longevity of these materials and the benefits that they have over a longer time, and the fact that when you choose more resilient materials, the emissions profile will be far better than other materials. So I think as an industry, whether it be me for stainless steels, members of World Steel for carbon and general steels, people from the Aluminium Federation, we've all got a job to do to convince these groups of key influencers and peoples whose voices are heard loudly to understand the benefits that many of our products have, both in terms of operational longevity and emissions profiles. That doesn't mean we don't continue to do the work to decarbonize our production processes. That's equally important, but because it makes things better. But we have the opportunity, by clever choice of materials, to reduce our emissions profile quickly and very effectively. I hope I've answered the question in that sort of convoluted answer.
Yes, I think so. Thank you, Tim. I don't think there's any more questions, so I guess we can end the session here.
Yeah, if there are no more questions, that's great. I mean, I think they were good, really good questions, and perhaps not the ones I was naturally expecting, but that's always nice to get something that's a little more left field. And as Joe said, if people want more data related to any of the topics I've presented, or particularly the questions, you know, please contact us. You can drop me an email on collins@worldstainless.org, and I will definitely respond to you. But thank you everybody for listening. I hope you found it interesting, thought-provoking, and at some points a little controversial. It was meant to be all those things, and we look forward to welcoming people to a future webinar. Thank you, take care, and please think stainless.